Atomic Habits by James Clear. There is a story James Clear tells near the very beginning of this book that is worth sitting with before anything else. On November 5th, 1994, a 14-year-old sophomore at Hamilton High School in Ohio named James Clear was struck in the face by a baseball bat during a warm-up drill. It was an accident. Another player had swung without warning, and Clear walked into the path of it. The impact fractured his nose, shattered his eye socket, left him with a severe brain injury and two blown pupils that doctors described as one of the most telling signs of brain damage they ever encountered. His parents were told to prepare for the worst.
He didn't die.
He didn't even stop playing baseball. But the road back was long and difficult and, for a period of time, genuinely humiliating. He had been a good player before the accident. After it, he returned to his team as a shadow of himself, unsteady, slower, his reflexes damaged, his confidence shattered. He spent his high school years watching from the bench. He went to college, joined the team at Denison University, and sat on the bench there too. Only in his sophomore year, through a process he couldn't have fully explained at the time, did things begin to change. He started sleeping earlier, making his bed in the morning, getting organized, keeping his room clean. Each change was tiny. None of them felt like they should matter. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. By the time he graduated, he was on the dean's list. He was named Denison's Male Athlete of the Year. He was named to the ESPN Academic All-America team, an honor given to only 33 players in the entire country. His story had gone from near tragedy to something remarkable, and not through a single dramatic turning point, not through one transformative decision, but through an accumulation of small, consistent changes that compounded over time into something he never could have predicted from any individual piece. This is the experience at the heart of Atomic Habits. Not a theory he found in a textbook. Not a framework he borrowed from a management consultant. A lived, embodied, hard-won understanding of something that the existing literature on habits had, in his view, failed to capture with enough clarity or enough practicality. And that understanding became, over the course of years of writing on his blog and refining his thinking with hundreds of thousands of readers, the book published in 2018 that went on to become one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the decade. Over 20 million copies sold. 50 languages. A permanent fixture on corporate reading lists, on college syllabi, on the nightstands of people who have tried to change and failed and are willing to try one more time. So what does it actually say? Not the Twitter-length summary, not the bullet point list you've probably seen, but the full argument, all of it, in the depth it deserves. That's what we're going to do. Let's start at the very beginning. Part 1. The aggregation of marginal gains. Why tiny changes matter more than you think. The first thing Clear wants you to understand, the conceptual foundation everything else is built on, is this. Small changes are not small in their long-term consequences. They are the only things that actually produce large consequences, because large consequences are almost never the product of a single large change. They are the product of small changes, compounded. He uses a mathematical illustration that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. If you improve by 1% every single day for an entire year, you don't end up 165% better. You end up 37 times better. That's the mathematics of compounding. The same force that makes Albert Einstein's supposed favorite idea, compound interest, so powerful in finance. Small improvements, relentlessly stacked, produce outcomes that dwarf what any single breakthrough ever could. And here is the terrifying flip side, which Clear states with equal clarity. If you get 1% worse every day for a year, you don't decline by 365%. You decline to nearly zero. Marginal gains and marginal losses compound with equal ruthlessness. The small things you do consistently are, over time, the only thing that matters. He introduces a concept here that he calls the plateau of latent potential, and it is one of the most practically important ideas in the book. When you start a new habit, going to the gym, learning a language, building a reading practice, you do not see results immediately. You work consistently for days, then weeks, then maybe months, and nothing seems to be changing. This is the plateau. The work is happening. The compounding is occurring. But the change hasn't broken through the surface into something you can see or measure yet. It's building underground, like the root system of a bamboo plant that grows those roots for years before breaking the surface, and then shoots up meters in a matter of weeks. Most people give up during the plateau of latent potential. They quit the gym after 6 weeks because they don't see the body changing. They abandon the language app after a month because they still can't hold a conversation. They stop the writing practice because the words still aren't coming easily. And they almost always quit right before the inflection point, right before the accumulated work would have produced visible results. Clear calls this the valley of disappointment, and he argues it is the primary reason most attempts at habit change fail. Not lack of motivation, not lack of knowledge, just the misunderstanding that change should be visible and immediate when it is almost never either. He uses the British cycling team as a central case study here, drawing on the story of Dave Brailsford, who took over as performance director of British cycling in 2003. At that point, the British hadn't won an Olympic gold medal in road or track cycling in 76 years. No British cyclist had ever won the Tour de France. The team was mediocre by elite standards, with no particular expectation of becoming otherwise. Brailsford came in with a philosophy he called the aggregation of marginal gains. The idea was to find a 1% improvement in every single aspect of cycling, not just training and racing, but everything. They redesigned the bike seats to make them more comfortable. They tested different massage gels to find the one that produced the fastest muscle recovery. They painted the inside of the team truck white so mechanics could spot dust on the components that might compromise performance. They taught riders the optimal way to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infection. Individually, each change was trivially small. Collectively, compounded over 5 years, they produced results that nobody thought were possible. In the 2008 Beijing Olympics, British cyclists won 60% of the gold medals available in track cycling. In the 4 years that followed, they set 9 Olympic records and 7 world records. And in 2012, Bradley Wiggins became the first British cyclist in history to win the Tour de France. By 2018, British riders had won 5 of the previous 6 tours. The aggregation of marginal gains. Not genius. Not a breakthrough. A philosophy of small improvements, relentlessly applied. This is the intellectual foundation of everything that follows. Part 2. Systems over goals. The distinction that changes everything before getting into the mechanics of habit formation. Clear wants to establish something that cuts against almost everything conventional goal-setting culture has told you. He wants to make a careful and important distinction between goals and systems. And his claim is that almost all of us have been focusing on the wrong one. Goals are the outcomes you want. Systems are the processes that lead to those outcomes. The goal is to run a marathon. The system is how you train every day. The goal is to write a book. The system is when and how you sit down and write consistently. The goal is to build a successful business. The system is how you recruit, sell, deliver, and improve week after week. The self-improvement industry has, for decades, been focused almost entirely on goals. Set clear goals. Visualize your goals. Make your goals smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. And while none of this advice is exactly wrong, Clear argues it has a fundamental problem. Winners and losers have the same goals. Every athlete competing in an Olympics wants to win a gold medal. Every startup founder wants to build a successful company. The goal doesn't differentiate anyone. What differentiates them is the quality of their systems, the daily practices, the recurring behaviors, the habits that either produce excellence or don't. He makes 4 specific arguments against goals as the primary focus, and each is worth hearing. First, achieving a goal only changes your life for a moment. You lose the weight. Then what? If you focused entirely on the goal and not on the system that produced it, you have no mechanism for maintaining the outcome. The goal disappears the moment it's achieved, but the problem it was solving doesn't. You needed a system, not a destination. Second, goals restrict happiness to a single future moment. You decide you'll be happy when you achieve the goal. And until then, by implication, you're in a state of pre-happiness, waiting for the future to arrive so you can start enjoying the present. Systems thinking allows you to find satisfaction in the process itself every time you execute the system well, rather than deferring all satisfaction to a single future outcome. Third, goal orientation produces a yo-yo effect. You train for the marathon and then stop training after the race. You diet for the reunion and then return to old patterns after. Goals have endpoints. Systems don't. A system continues running after any individual milestone is reached because it's not organized around the milestone, it's organized around ongoing behavior. Fourth, goals are at odds with long-term progress. They're finish lines that, once crossed, signal completion. Systems are never complete. They're always running. And the person who wants to improve continuously needs a system because a system has no finish line to cross and then stop. The most important quote in the entire book might be this one. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. Read that again. You fall to the level of your systems. Not the level of your goals, your motivation, your dreams, your willpower, your systems. What you do consistently, automatically, without heroic effort, that is what determines where you end up. Everything else is hope. Part 3. Identity-based habits. The deepest level of change we have arrived at what I think is the most original and most important idea in the book. The one that most clearly separates Atomic Habits from the hundreds of other productivity and behavior change books that existed before it. The concept of identity-based habits. Most habit change approaches operate at the level of outcomes. You want to lose weight, so you change what you eat and how you exercise. You want to be more productive, so you install a new app or restructure your calendar. You're targeting the outcome you want and working backward to the behaviors required to achieve it. This is, at first glance, perfectly logical. And it is also, Clear argues, exactly backwards. He describes 3 concentric circles of change. The outermost circle is outcomes, what you get. The middle circle is processes, what you do. The innermost circle is identity, what you believe. Most habit change attempts start from the outside and change the outcome you want and adjust your behavior to match. What Clear proposes instead is to start from the inside out. Start with identity. Change what you believe about who you are, and let the behaviors follow naturally from that belief. Here is the most powerful illustration he uses. Imagine 2 people trying to quit smoking. Someone offers them both a cigarette. The first person says, "No thanks, I'm trying to quit." The second person says, "No thanks, I'm not a smoker." These 2 responses sound similar. They are not. The first person still thinks of themselves as a smoker who is currently suppressing the desire to smoke. Their identity is in conflict with their behavior. That conflict is exhausting, and it's why most behavior change requires so much willpower, because willpower is what you need to maintain behavior that contradicts your identity. The second person has changed their identity. They are not a smoker. Rejecting the cigarette isn't an act of self-control. It's a straightforward expression of who they are. Every action you take, Clear argues, is a vote for a particular identity. When you go for a run, you cast a vote for the identity of person who runs. When you write a page, you cast a vote for person who writes. When you meditate for 5 minutes, you cast a vote for person who meditates. No single vote decides the election. But over time, enough votes in one direction create an overwhelming majority, and your brain begins to believe the identity those votes are accumulating for. This is why Clear calls habits the compound interest of self-improvement. Each small action is both immediately beneficial and also a deposit in the identity account, earning compound interest in the form of a gradually solidifying belief about who you are. The practical process for working with this is 2 steps, and Clear states them with elegant simplicity. First, decide what type of person you want to be. Not what you want to achieve, who you want to become. Second, prove it to yourself with small wins. Take the smallest possible action consistent with that identity, and do it consistently enough that the evidence accumulates into a conviction. This reframes the entire relationship between behavior and identity. Most people wait until they feel like the person before they act like the person. I'll go to the gym when I feel motivated. I'll start writing when I feel inspired. Clear's argument is that this is backwards. You act like the person first, repeatedly, and you feel like the person as a consequence of the accumulated evidence. The identity follows the behavior. It does not precede it. Part 4. The habit loop. Stewie, craving, response, reward. Having established the philosophical and conceptual foundation, why small habits matter, why systems beat goals, why identity is the engine of lasting change, Clear now moves into the mechanism. How do habits actually form? What is the biological and psychological structure of a habit? And understanding that structure precisely, how do you deliberately build or break one? The habit loop, which Clear builds on from Charles Duhigg's earlier work in The Power of Habit but extends significantly, has 4 components: the cue, the craving, the response, and the reward. Together, these 4 stages form a neurological feedback loop that, when repeated enough times, becomes automatic, becomes, in the precise sense of the word, a habit. The cue is the trigger. It's the piece of information that tells your brain that a reward is available. A cue can be almost anything: a time of day, a location, an emotional state, another person, a preceding behavior. The cue doesn't cause the habit directly. It causes a prediction. Your brain has learned, through previous repetition, that this particular trigger predicts a particular reward. And that prediction produces the second component, the craving. The craving is the motivational force. It's the desire that drives you toward the habit. Clear makes an important distinction here that most discussions of habits miss entirely. You don't actually crave the habit itself. You crave the state change the habit produces. The smoker doesn't crave the cigarette. They crave the feeling of relief and relaxation the cigarette has previously delivered. The person who checks their phone doesn't crave the act of looking at a screen. They crave the stimulation, the connection, the hit of novelty that the phone might provide. Understanding this distinction matters because it means the same craving can be satisfied by different responses, which is one of the most powerful tools for changing habits. The response is the actual behavior, the habit itself. Whether a response occurs depends on 2 things: how strong the craving is and how much friction is associated with the behavior. If the craving is strong enough and the habit is easy enough, the response happens. If the friction is high, if the habit requires significant effort or inconvenience to execute, the craving may not be sufficient to overcome it and the habit won't occur. The reward is what brings everything together. The reward satisfies the craving, providing the state change that was predicted. And it teaches the brain that this cue-response sequence is worth storing, worth automating, worth encoding in neural pathways that will run again the next time the cue appears. The reward is what makes the habit stick. What happens if any of these components is missing? Clear is precise about this. Without a cue, the habit never starts. Without a craving, there is no motivation to act. Without a sufficient response, no behavior occurs. Without a satisfying reward, the brain has no reason to encode the loop. A habit requires all 4 components working together. Understanding this means you can diagnose exactly why a habit isn't forming, identify which component is weak or absent, and fix it with surgical precision rather than vague motivational effort. Clear now organizes the entire practical portion of the book around 4 laws, each corresponding to one component of the habit loop. To build a good habit, make the cue obvious, make the craving attractive, make the response easy, make the reward satisfying. To break a bad habit, invert each law. Make the cue invisible, make the craving unattractive, make the response difficult, make the reward unsatisfying. This is the architecture of the entire practical program. Let's walk through each law in full. Part 5. The first law. Make it obvious. The first law addresses the cue stage of the habit loop, and its central insight is this. Most of our habits begin with cues we are not consciously aware of. We pick up our phones without deciding to. We reach for snacks without choosing to. We sit down in front of the television without planning to. The habits fire automatically in response to environmental cues that trigger them below the threshold of conscious notice. This automation is, in most contexts, a feature. It allows us to conserve cognitive energy by putting routine behaviors on autopilot. But it also means that bad habits are often invisible to us until we develop the ability to see them. Clear's first practical tool is what he calls the habit scorecard, a simple exercise in which you write down every habit you currently have as neutrally and completely as possible. And then evaluate each one. Is this habit taking me toward the person I want to become or away from them? The goal is not to judge or criticize. The goal is to see clearly. Most people, when they actually write out their daily behaviors in sequence, are genuinely surprised by what they notice. Patterns they were completely unaware of, triggers they hadn't consciously registered, chains of behavior that unfold automatically throughout the day. Once you can see your cues, you can begin to design them intentionally. And the most powerful technique Clear introduces for this is the implementation intention. An implementation intention is a plan that specifies exactly when and where you will perform a new habit. The formula is, I will do behavior X at time Y and location Z. Not I'm going to exercise more, but I will go to the gym on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 in the morning at the gym on Oak Street. The specificity is the point. Research consistently shows that people who define exactly when and where they will perform a new behavior are dramatically more likely to actually do it. Vague intentions produce vague results. Specific intentions activate the neural pathways that recognize the specified conditions and trigger the associated behavior when those conditions arrive. Building on implementation intentions is what Clear calls habit stacking. The insight is elegant. Existing habits are already strong cues because they fire reliably and automatically. If you attach a new habit to an existing one, using the end of the existing habit as the cue for the new one, you inherit the automaticity of the existing habit for your new one. The formula is, after I do current habit, I will do new habit. After I pour my morning coffee, I will meditate for 5 minutes. After I sit down at my desk, I will write 3 sentences. After I take off my work shoes, I will put on my workout clothes. Each link in the chain gets the pull of the links before it. The most important practical insight in the first law, though, is one that most people genuinely underestimate. Your environment is the most powerful cue system you have. Every object in your physical environment is a potential trigger for behavior. The visible bag of chips on the counter, the phone charging next to the bed, the guitar sitting in the corner behind the door you never open. Clear argues that environment design, deliberately organizing your physical space to make good habits obvious and bad habits invisible, is dramatically more powerful than motivation or willpower for most people. He uses the cafeteria study at Massachusetts General Hospital as his central example. Dr. and Thorndike wanted to reduce sugary soda consumption among hospital staff without changing any policies, without any signs or campaigns, without asking anyone to change their behavior. She simply reorganized the refrigerators. Water was added to every refrigerator and placed at eye level. Sodas were moved to the bottom and back. Within 3 months, sugary drink sales had dropped 11% and bottled water sales had increased 25%. Nobody was told to drink less soda. The environment was changed and behavior followed automatically. This principle scales to every area of life. Want to read more? Put a book on your pillow instead of your phone charger. Want to eat healthier? Keep fruit on the counter and put cookies on the highest shelf in the back of the pantry. Want to exercise more? Sleep in your workout clothes or lay them out the night before. Want to practice guitar more? Put it on a stand in the middle of the room instead of in the case in the closet. You are not fighting your own laziness or lack of discipline. You're engineering the environment to make the right behavior the obvious, easy, automatic one. Part 6. The second law. Make it attractive. The second law addresses the craving stage. And it starts with neuroscience that is worth understanding because it explains something important about why habits feel the way they feel. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most associated with pleasure and reward, the chemical your brain releases when you experience something enjoyable. But here's the nuance that most people miss. Dopamine doesn't just spike when you receive a reward. It spikes in anticipation of the reward. The craving itself produces dopamine. The scroll of the social media feed, the moment before you open an email, the ritual before the first bite of a meal you're excited about, the anticipation is actually more dopaminergic than the receipt. What this means practically is that making a habit attractive doesn't require making the behavior itself pleasurable. It requires making the anticipation of the behavior engaging. This is the psychological basis for what Clear calls temptation bundling. The idea is straightforward. Pair something you need to do with something you want to do. Only allow yourself to watch your favorite podcast while at the gym. Only allow yourself to check social media while doing a chore you dislike. Only allow yourself to have a coffee from your favorite place if you first sat down and done 20 minutes of writing. You're creating a craving, the thing you want, that is now only satisfied through the behavior you need. Clear also introduces a social dimension to the craving that is often overlooked in habit literature. Humans are deeply social creatures, shaped by millions of years of evolution to care intensely about what our group does and thinks. We naturally imitate the habits of three specific groups: the close, people we spend the most time with; the many, the broader culture or crowd; and the powerful, people with status and prestige we aspire to. This is both a trap and an opportunity. The trap: if you spend most of your time around people whose habits are not the ones you want to build, their norms will pull you back toward their behaviors regardless of your individual motivation. The opportunity: if you can find a group, a community, a team, a culture, where the behavior you want to build is the norm, suddenly you're not fighting against social pressure. You're being pulled forward by it. The habit that makes you feel like an outsider in one group makes you feel like an insider in the other. Clear argues that joining a culture where your desired behavior is normal is one of the most powerful things you can do for habit change. One of the most effective things a person trying to build a reading habit can do is join a book club. One of the most effective things a person trying to get fit can do is find a gym community where going is what people do. He also addresses what he calls reframing, changing the way you interpret and narrate your habits to yourself. Most people who have to go to the gym approach it with some version of, I have to do this. Clear suggests reframing to, I get to do this. Not as fake positivity, not as a trick to force enthusiasm, but as a genuine recognition that the ability to exercise, to improve, to work toward who you want to become is a privilege, one that not everyone has. The athlete who says, I have to run today, and the athlete who says, I get to run today, perform the same behavior. But only one of them is building an identity as someone who values the run. Part 7. The third law. Make it easy. The third law is perhaps the most immediately actionable in the book. And it starts with a concept called the law of least effort that is as basic as human biology. Given a choice between two behaviors that produce the same outcome, we will almost always choose the one that requires less energy. This is not laziness in the moral sense. It's energy conservation in the biological sense, a deeply adaptive feature of our nervous system that has allowed us to function efficiently throughout human history. The implication is striking. The amount of friction associated with a behavior is one of the most powerful determinants of whether it occurs. Not your motivation, not your intentions, not your values. The friction. A behavior that is one step easier to perform is dramatically more likely to happen than a behavior that is slightly more inconvenient, even if the outcome of both is identical and the motivation for both is equal. Clear's prescription for the third law is to be a strategic friction engineer. For good habits, identify the friction that's preventing them and systematically reduce or eliminate it. For bad habits, add friction deliberately, making them harder to initiate. He uses the concept of decisive moments to sharpen this. Throughout your day, there are a small number of moments that disproportionately determine what follows. The moment you get home from work and decide whether to change into workout clothes or sit on the couch. The moment you open a browser and decide whether to navigate to a productive site or a time-wasting one. The moment you walk into the kitchen and decide whether to cook or order delivery. These moments set the trajectory of everything that follows. And the way to improve your outcomes at these moments is not to summon more willpower in the moment itself. It's to prepare the environment in advance so that the right behavior at the decisive moment has the least friction. The most famous technique in the entire book emerges from this third law, the 2-minute rule. The rule is simple and almost comically modest. When you start a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do. You want to start running? Your habit is to put on your running shoes. You want to start reading before bed? Your habit is to open the book. You want to start meditating? Your habit is to sit in the chair. Not meditate for 20 minutes. Just sit in the chair. This sounds like it can't possibly work, and then it does. Here's why. The biggest barrier to any habit is starting. The resistance to beginning is almost always larger than the resistance to continuing. A person who has laced their running shoes has already overcome the largest obstacle to going for a run. A person who has opened the book is most of the way to reading a chapter. The 2-minute version of the habit is a master key. It unlocks the door. And once you're through the door, the rest usually follows. Clear is explicit that the 2-minute version isn't the destination. It's the gateway. Once the habit of showing up is established, once the cue reliably triggers the appearance at the gym, the desk, the meditation cushion, you can gradually extend the behavior. But start with the smallest possible version. Make it easy doesn't mean make it trivial. It means remove every unnecessary obstacle between you and the first step. He also introduces the concept of commitment devices, choices made in the present that lock in better behavior in the future. Ulysses tying himself to the mast so he could hear the sirens without being able to follow them is the classical example. Modern equivalents: scheduling workouts with a trainer you'd feel bad canceling on, putting your phone in a different room before bed so you can't scroll, leaving your wallet at home when you go somewhere you're trying to spend less. The commitment device uses present judgment to constrain future behavior, protecting you from your own impulses in weaker moments. Part 8. The fourth law. Make it satisfying. The fourth law addresses the reward stage, and it confronts a fundamental problem with being a human alive in modern civilization. Our brains are optimized for immediate rewards, and most of the behaviors that produce the best long-term outcomes produce no immediate reward at all. Clear calls this the cardinal rule of behavior change. What is immediately rewarded is repeated. What is immediately punished is avoided. This is as basic as any principle in behavioral psychology. And it creates an obvious problem. The reward for exercising today arrives months from now in the form of a healthier body. The reward for saving money today arrives years from now in the form of financial security. The reward for studying today arrives at the end of the semester. All of the most important long-term behaviors have delayed rewards, and our brains, shaped by 1,000,000 years of survival in environments where the future was genuinely uncertain, prioritize immediate payoffs with overwhelming force. The practical solution is not to fight this wiring, but to work with it. Create immediate rewards for behaviors with delayed payoffs. Not necessarily large rewards. Not rewards that undermine the habit itself. Don't reward yourself for exercising with a piece of cake. But something that provides an immediate signal of completion and satisfaction. A small visual marker. A check in a habit tracker. A note in a journal. A specific phrase you say to yourself. The reward doesn't need to be large. It needs to be immediate enough to close the feedback loop today rather than months from now. The habit tracker is the tool Clear introduces most prominently for this. At its simplest, a habit tracker is nothing more than a calendar where you mark an X on each day you perform a habit. The visual chain of X's becomes its own motivator. You want to keep the chain going, and the visual representation of the streak provides an immediate reward every time you add to it. Clear is careful to note that habit tracking can itself become a trap if you're not thoughtful about it. Tracking can shift your focus from the behavior itself to the appearance of performing the behavior. You start managing the tracker rather than the habit. He cites Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. One of the most memorable formulations in the book comes in this section. Never miss twice. Missing once is human. Life intervenes. Schedules break. The important thing after you miss is to get back on the next day. Missing twice is the beginning of a new habit, the habit of not doing the thing. The goal after missing a day is not to perform perfectly. It's to perform minimally, to do something, even a dramatically reduced version of the habit, to maintain the thread of consistency. 2 minutes of exercise on a day, when you can't do more, is enormously more valuable than nothing because it keeps the identity vote alive. Part 9. The Goldilocks Rule and the Valley of Boredom. Having walked through all 4 laws, Clear turns to a challenge that doesn't get enough attention in most habit literature. What happens after the habit is established? What happens when the behavior is automatic? The motivation has settled from initial enthusiasm into comfortable routine, and the real enemy is no longer failure, but boredom. He introduces what he calls the Goldilocks rule. Humans experience peak motivation when working on tasks that are right at the edge of their current abilities. Not too easy, not too hard. Just at the boundary of what they can currently do. Psychologists call this state flow, the condition of complete engagement that arises when challenge and skill are in balance. Too easy and the task is boring. Too hard and the task is overwhelming. Right at the edge of capacity, flow. The implication for habits is that as you get better at something, the original version of the habit loses its Goldilocks calibration. What was once challenging becomes easy. And what is easy is boring. The person who started meditating for 5 minutes because it was challenging eventually finds 5 minutes trivially comfortable and needs to extend the practice to maintain engagement. The runner who once found 3 miles difficult needs to add distance or pace to keep the challenge alive. This is fine and manageable when you're aware of it. What Clear wants you to understand is that the greatest threat to your long-term habits is not failure. It's boredom. Because motivation naturally declines as a habit becomes automatic. This is, again, a feature, not a bug. Automation is what makes habits efficient. The behaviors that produce the most long-term results are often not the most exciting ones to perform on any given day. The professional athlete shows up to practice on days they don't want to. The writer produces pages on days the words don't want to come. The investor keeps contributing to their account on days the market is down, and everything feels pointless. Clear cites a conversation he imagined between someone asking a top coach what separates champions from everyone else. The answer: the ability to do what needs to be done even when it's boring. Even when the novelty is completely gone. Even when you've done this exact thing 1,000 times, and there is nothing new or exciting about doing it 1,001. This capacity to show up for the practice that doesn't feel like anything special is, in the end, what separates the good from the great. Part 10. Advanced Tactics, Genetics, Flow, and the Continuous Improvement Loop. The final section of the book addresses a set of questions that the earlier framework leaves open. Questions about individual differences. About how to know whether you're pursuing the right habits for you specifically. About the role of talent versus practice. About the relationship between consistency and mastery. Clear's treatment of genetics is careful and worth understanding. He argues that genes don't determine your destiny, but they do significantly influence your inclinations. Your biology shapes how naturally you take to certain types of tasks, how much energy they cost you versus reward you, how readily you enter flow states when doing them. This is not an argument for fatalism, for accepting your natural tendencies as fixed, but it is an argument for looking honestly at what you find effortful versus effortless, and using that signal. He introduces the concept of explore-exploit, thinking borrowed from computer science and behavioral economics. Early in any domain, you should explore widely, try many different approaches, habits, skills, practices before committing deeply to any one of them. This exploration phase is how you discover what suits you. It's how you find where your natural inclinations and the demands of a skill align most comfortably. Once you've found something with good alignment, you shift to exploitation, going deep, repeating, refining, building the compound returns of consistent practice. The practical message: if you're struggling to build a habit despite genuine effort and correct application of the 4 laws, it's worth asking whether you're pursuing the right habit for you. Not every habit is equally natural for every person. And while the mechanics of habit formation are universal, the habits that produce the most value for you specifically are the ones where the doing feels somewhat natural, where you enjoy the process more than most people do, where the effort required feels proportionate rather than heroic. Finding those is worth taking time over. Clear also introduces the concept of the habit performance curve, the idea that as you practice, the execution of the habit requires less and less conscious effort. Habits move from the prefrontal cortex, where conscious, deliberate thought happens, to the basal ganglia, where automatic behavior is stored. This is the process of skill becoming automatic. And it creates a specific risk. Once a behavior is automatic, you stop noticing it as carefully. You stop learning from it as rapidly. The feedback loop that drove improvement during the learning phase gets quieter as the behavior becomes routine. The person who runs the same route at the same pace every day gets fit and then plateaus, because the habit is set but the learning has stopped. The solution is what he calls the continuous improvement loop, a deliberate practice of reviewing your habits regularly, asking whether they are still serving you, and asking what the next incremental improvement looks like. He describes his own annual review process and 6-month integrity reports, structured periods of reflection in which he asks, what went well this year? What didn't go well? What am I learning? How am I living up to my own values? This kind of regular reflection prevents the drift that happens when habits run on autopilot for too long without being examined. The critique, where Atomic Habits falls short, oversimplifies, and leaves you wanting more. Alright, let's be honest. Because this book deserves honest engagement. And honest engagement means naming, with real specificity, the places where Atomic Habits doesn't deliver everything it promises, or where the things it delivers are less solid than they appear. Let's start with the biggest and most fundamental critique. The 1% better everyday compounding claim is mathematically true and practically misleading. Yes, if you improve by exactly 1% every single day for 365 days, you end up 37 times better. That math is correct. What the math ignores is that human performance in the real world doesn't compound like interest in a bank account. You can't get 1% better at playing piano every single day indefinitely because skill development follows diminishing returns. Early improvements are large and rapid. Later improvements are marginal and slow. The compounding of marginal gains is real in some contexts and entirely inapplicable in others, and the book presents it as universal when it isn't. The British cycling story is genuine and striking, but it is also a cherry-picked example from a domain, elite competitive sports with measurable performance metrics and professional coaching infrastructure, that is wildly different from most people's actual lives. Second, the book presents the 4 laws as if they are a complete and sufficient framework for behavior change for virtually any person in virtually any circumstance. They are not. The cue craving response reward loop and the 4 laws built on it are primarily derived from behavioral psychology, the science of observable, external behavior. They largely bypass the internal, psychological dimensions of habit formation, emotional regulation, trauma history, depression, and anxiety, the impact of chronic stress on executive function, the specific challenges of neurodivergent brains, and the ways that compulsive behaviors like addiction, binge eating, and self-harm operate through mechanisms that the 4 laws model doesn't adequately capture. Clear acknowledges, briefly, that the book isn't designed for people dealing with addiction or serious behavioral health challenges. But the acknowledgement is so brief, and the tone of the book so confident, that many readers with exactly these challenges will read it, try the techniques, fail to get traction, and conclude that they are uniquely broken rather than that they're using a tool that wasn't designed for their actual situation. This isn't the minor caveat. For a significant portion of the population, the reasons habits aren't working have nothing to do with cue design or friction or immediate rewards. They have to do with mental health, neurological differences, trauma, and circumstance. Atomic Habits is genuinely useful for a wide range of people. It is not universally applicable, and its confidence can make people feel inadequate when the universal solution doesn't work for their non-universal problem. Third, the identity-based habits concept, which is the most original and arguably most valuable idea in the book, is presented more simply than it actually is. Decide who you want to be and prove it with small wins.
Clean.
Elegant. Actionable. But it glosses over the genuinely hard question of what to do when your current identity is very strongly formed in a direction you want to change. The person who has spent 40 years identifying as not an athletic person, or a smoker, or someone who struggles with money, is not going to find that 2 or 3 small wins quickly override those deeply embedded self-perceptions. Identity change is a long, messy, nonlinear process that involves grief as much as growth. The old identity has to die before the new one can fully live. The book presents this process as cleaner than it is for the people for whom it's hardest. Fourth, the repetition in the book is significant. Clear himself is an excellent writer and communicator, and the book is genuinely readable. But the core content, the habit loop, the 4 laws, their applications could be conveyed in considerably fewer pages than it takes. The book runs 250 pages and contains substantial repetition, with each chapter ending in a summary that recaps what was just explained, and several concepts being illustrated through multiple examples that add breadth but limited depth. Many readers and reviewers have noted this. It matters not because it makes the book bad, it doesn't, but because it contributes to the impression of comprehensiveness that the book's actual research depth doesn't always support. Fifth, and this is the critique that academic psychologists and behavioral scientists raise most frequently, Clear is not a researcher. He is a synthesizer and a communicator, and he is an excellent one. But the book's sources are uneven in quality, and the way they are used is sometimes problematic. The British cycling example is real. Some of the other examples are more loosely grounded, anecdotes presented as evidence, case studies chosen for illustrative value rather than representativeness, and in a few noted cases, social media posts and online threads cited in ways that would not meet any standard of academic evidence. Clear asserts in the introduction that science supports everything he's written. That claim is stronger than the evidence actually supports, and the confidence with which the book presents its framework can lead readers to treat its prescriptions as more established and universal than they actually are. Sixth, the book has a structural blind spot around systemic and social barriers to behavior change that is significant enough to name clearly. The habit of exercising regularly is easier to build if you have time that isn't consumed by multiple jobs, a body that isn't dealing with chronic pain or disability, a neighborhood with safe outdoor space or an accessible gym, and the financial security to not be in a constant state of stress that depletes executive function. The habit of eating healthy is easier to build if you live near a grocery store with affordable fresh food and have time to cook. Many of the examples in Atomic Habits assume a baseline of material security and temporal autonomy that is not universal, and the book's silence on this means it implicitly treats individual habit design as the solution to problems that are at least partially structural. This doesn't make the advice wrong for people who have that baseline. It makes the book less useful than it could be at honestly representing who it is and isn't for. Seventh, the book takes a largely uncritical view of productivity and optimization itself. The implicit assumption throughout is that becoming better, improving your habits, building systems, optimizing your behavior are self-evidently good things to do. But there is a genuine question, one that philosophers, psychologists, and social critics have raised with increasing urgency, about whether the optimization mindset, applied to the entire surface area of your life, produces flourishing or produces a particular kind of exhausted, self-surveilling, permanently dissatisfied person who is always trying to squeeze another 1% out of themselves. The person who reads Atomic Habits and starts tracking 17 habits simultaneously and reviewing their progress weekly and designing their environment and doing habit stacking throughout their day is not necessarily a happier, more fulfilled person than someone who lives more loosely, more spontaneously, less optimized. The book doesn't engage with this question at all because it assumes the answer is obvious. But it isn't obvious. And finally, the knowing-doing gap, which we've mentioned in previous books and which is worth mentioning again because it is the universal limitation of every book in this genre. Reading Atomic Habits is not the same as building atomic habits. The book is, genuinely, among the best-designed practical behavior change frameworks in popular nonfiction. The 4 laws are clear, memorable, and well-grounded. The specific techniques, implementation intentions, habit stacking, the 2-minute rule, environment design, the never miss twice principle, are real tools that work for real people when applied consistently. But reading about them produces a feeling of competence and readiness that is not the same as the actual competence and readiness that only comes from practice. The gap between finishing the book and changing your life is the entire gap. And it is bridged only by doing things the book recommends, not by understanding things the book explains. Finishing Atomic Habits and feeling inspired is a pleasant experience. Starting with one small, specific habit tomorrow and doing it for 90 consecutive days is a different experience entirely. The book gives you every tool you need for the second one. Whether you do the second one is entirely, irreducibly yours. Final thoughts: what Atomic Habits ultimately gives you is a language. A precise, practical, actionable language for talking about behavior change in a way that most of us never had before. You probably always knew, in some vague way, that small actions matter, that consistency beats intensity, that your environment shapes your behavior, that who you think you are influences what you do. Clear didn't invent these insights, but he organized them, systematized them, illustrated them with memorable stories, and packaged them into a framework clear enough to actually use. The book's most enduring contribution is the identity concept. Every action is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. This idea, taken seriously, changes the way you relate to every small behavior. The 2 minutes of reading isn't just 2 minutes of reading. It's a vote for, I am a reader. The skipped workout doesn't just mean you didn't exercise. It's a vote for the identity you're trying to leave behind. This makes every small act consequential in a way that motivational content about big goals never managed to achieve. Clear ends the book with a sentiment that is understated but worth holding. There is no finish line. Systems don't have endings. The work of building good habits and breaking bad ones is not a project with a completion date. It is a practice with no end point, a continuous refinement of who you are and how you show up. The goal is not to arrive at perfect habits and then coast. The goal is to become the kind of person who is always working, always adjusting, always getting slightly better, not because perfection is the target, but because growth is the natural condition of a life being lived with genuine attention. That, more than any specific technique, is what Atomic Habits is really teaching. Not the 2-minute rule, not habit stacking, but the underlying orientation. Be a little better today than you were yesterday. Not dramatically better. Not better in ways that require willpower and heroism. Just a little better. A vote for the person you're becoming. An atom added to the compound. It adds up. It always adds up.